The war is over. But for many, it hasn't ended. It's unraveling. A gray morning settles over a makeshift camp on the outskirts of Dresden. The air is damp, filled with the scent of wet earth and diesel smoke. Beyond the barbed wire, the world is silent. No gunfire, no engines, just wind moving through broken pine trees. Rows of women stand still, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Some wear the faded gray of the Wehrmacht auxiliaries. Others, the dark blue of the Luftwaffe Communications Corps. A few, the black armband of the SS Helferinnen. The female staff who once carried the insignia of a regime now erased. An Allied officer steps forward, clipboard in hand. His voice cuts through the stillness. Remove your uniforms. Burn them. No one speaks. Bundles of cloth are thrown into the flames. The eagle insignias, the lightning bolts, the stitched swastikas. The fire hisses and crackles, swallowing the symbols that once defined them. Some women watch without expression. Others turn away, tears glinting in their eyes. For the first time, the power that once clothed them turns to smoke. What they wear next will not carry a nation, an ideology, or a lie. And as the smoke drifts upward, Germany itself seems to dissolve into the gray sky above. By early 1945, the Third Reich was dying. Berlin, once the proud heart of Hitler's empire, had become a cratered ruin of smoke, rubble, and whispers. The Soviet Red Army had crossed the Oder. The Western Allies were moving through the Rhineland, and the Nazi chain of command was fracturing under its own delusions. The myth of the 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely 12. Inside this crumbling state, the role of women had shifted in ways even the Nazis had never imagined. When the war began, Hitler's regime had glorified women as mothers and homemakers. Kinder, Kusch, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. But as the front lines expanded and casualties mounted, ideology gave way to necessity. By 1943, over 500,000 German women had taken on active service in the military and auxiliary branches. They became Helferinnen, female helpers, serving in communications, anti-aircraft command posts, administration, and logistics. In the Luftwaffe, they operated radios, tracked enemy aircraft, and relayed fire control data to the gun crews. In the Wehrmacht, they typed orders, managed field offices, and distributed supplies. Some wore headsets, others carried sidearms. Many served close to combat zones, living in a constant hum of danger. And then there were those whose uniforms carried a darker stain. The Aufseherin, the female guards of the concentration camps. By 1945, more than 3,500 women had served in that system of terror. In Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen. Some were indoctrinated. Others were opportunists, seeking power in a regime that offered them rank, rations, and authority. Their presence blurred the line between service and complicity. When the Allied forces began their final push, these women, clerks, radio operators, nurses, and guards alike, suddenly found themselves on the same side of the fence, defeated, exposed, and hunted. The German command had promised the Endsieg, the final victory. But by April, defeat was absolute. In towns and villages, Hitler Youth units were fighting with wooden rifles while the SS executed deserters in public squares. Civilians fled westward by the millions, desperate to surrender to the British or Americans before the Soviets arrived. For many German women in uniform, the collapse came as a kind of personal implosion. The uniforms that had once represented pride and belonging now marked them as enemies of the world. When the surrender was signed on May 8, 1945, the Reich ceased to exist. But its symbols lived on, stitched into cloth, pressed into pins, and carved into the self-image of millions. The Allies understood this. They knew that uniforms carried more than fabric. They carried belief. In Soviet captivity, women were rounded up from administrative posts, hospitals, and radio units. Those who had worked for the SS were often separated, interrogated, and transported eastward. In the British and American zones, the approach was more methodical: registration, disarmament, and screening. But the emotional shock was the same everywhere. When orders came to remove the Nazi insignia, to burn the uniforms, badges, and armbands, many did so in silence. Others hesitated, clutching the fabric that had once given them purpose. The act wasn't just punishment, it was symbolic annihilation. To the victors, it was cleansing. To the defeated, it was erasure. The war had stripped Germany of its army, its government, and its ideology. Now, it was stripping its women of the last thing they still possessed: identity. And in the ashes of those uniforms lay a question that would haunt the post-war years. What does loyalty mean when the cause itself has turned to dust? The war had ended, but peace had not yet begun. Across the shattered landscape of Europe, millions of displaced people wandered through ruins. Soldiers without armies, refugees without homes, and women without uniforms. In the spring and summer of 1945, Allied troops swept through captured territories, establishing zones of control. Their mission was clear: dismantle Nazism from the ground up. This was not just a military victory, it was to be a moral cleansing. Every captured German soldier, officer, and auxiliary was processed, catalogued, and assigned a status. For male soldiers, the system was rigid: rank, branch, and political affiliation determined treatment. For women, it was chaos. The Allies had not expected to encounter so many uniformed women, nearly 500,000 across Europe. Most of them were Luftwaffe or Wehrmacht-Helferinnen, trained to operate radios, manage logistics, and decode communications. Others were nurses from field hospitals or secretaries from SS headquarters. A smaller number, but the most feared, were identified as guards or administrators in the concentration camp network. For the Allied soldiers processing them, the sight was often unsettling. Many of these women were young, disciplined, and still wearing their military attire. They marched when ordered, saluted instinctively, and referred to themselves by rank. Even in captivity, the hierarchy persisted. The uniforms were more than clothing. They were armor, psychological protection against the chaos that followed defeat. The Allied command recognized this immediately. In both the Western and Soviet occupation zones, new orders were issued. All captured German military women were to be stripped of their uniforms and insignia. In the British and American camps, this process was largely administrative. POWs were instructed to remove insignias, medals, and armbands before being issued simple gray or brown garments marked prisoner of war. In many instances, the old uniforms were piled and burned under supervision, both for hygiene and symbolism. But in the East, the process carried a harsher edge. Soviet forces viewed Nazi uniforms as emblems of oppression and atrocity. In the ruins of Warsaw, Minsk, and Kiev, they had seen too much suffering to treat the symbols lightly. When female SS auxiliaries were captured, Soviet officers often ordered them to destroy their uniforms immediately, by fire or burial. Refusal could lead to punishment. Witness accounts describe scenes of quiet humiliation. Women standing in line, ordered to remove coats, boots, and insignia patches. Flames devouring what once represented power. No speeches, no gestures of mercy, just silence, smoke, and surrender. For many, this was the moment the war truly ended. Until then, defeat had been abstract, a word on the radio, a rumor spreading through broken cities. But when the insignia burned, reality became undeniable. To the Allies, it was practical psychology. They wanted to erase not just the Nazi government, but the Nazi self-image. Uniforms carried the spirit of the regime, its discipline, pride, and superiority. To destroy the fabric was to dismantle the myth. This policy extended beyond the camps. In towns and villages, civilians were ordered to remove swastika flags, tear down propaganda, and destroy any emblems of Hitler's rule. Even portraits and photographs were confiscated or burned. Denazification had begun, but for the German women POWs, this process felt less like political cleansing and more like personal annihilation. Many had joined the service not out of ideology, but out of duty or survival. Yet now, stripped and branded as enemies, they shared the same shame as those who had served the regime's darkest purposes. For some, the order to burn their uniforms was an act of liberation, the final shedding of fear. For others, it was the death of identity. The smell of burning cloth lingered like guilt, heavy and unforgettable. As the smoke drifted over the camps and ruins, a question settled on the defeated land. If belief can be worn like a uniform, can it also be burned away? They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, yet they carried the weight of a lost army. For many German women, the war had been the center of their youth, a place where order, purpose, and belonging had been guaranteed. Inside the structure of the Reich, every task had meaning: decoding messages, serving in air defense units, managing logistics. When the flames consumed their uniforms, that meaning vanished. Eyewitnesses later described faces marked not with fear, but with emptiness. It was as if each woman was watching her own past dissolve into smoke. For years, the uniform had told them who they were, and now, stripped of it, they were no one. Some wept quietly, others clenched their fists, standing straight, refusing to show emotion. A few whispered prayers or muttered disbelief. Es kann nicht sein. It cannot be. Among them were those who had believed fully in the Nazi dream, raised on propaganda that promised eternal victory and national destiny. For them, the burning was not just defeat, but disillusionment. For others, who had served only out of duty or survival, the act carried a different kind of pain: the shame of association. In every camp, across Germany and occupied Europe, the moment played out differently, but the feeling was the same. The uniforms that once made them part of something greater now condemned them as part of something evil. And as the ashes settled, they realized that the world outside the fences would never see them as victims, only as remnants of a regime the world wanted to forget. From the Allied perspective, handling the surrender of female personnel was an unprecedented challenge. By May 1945, approximately 450,000 German women were serving in military or paramilitary roles. They manned switchboards, coded communications, and tracked enemy bombers. Some carried pistols. All were trained to obey. When the German armed forces capitulated, these women were scattered across hundreds of locations, from Berlin bunkers to air defense towers, from hospitals to SS administrative offices. The Allied command, British, American, French, and Soviet, faced an immediate question: were they soldiers or civilians? International law at the time had no clear category for them. In British zones, women were processed as auxiliary personnel, not combatants. They were placed in temporary camps, interrogated, and often released after short detentions, unless they had worked for the SS or Gestapo. In Soviet zones, the treatment was far harsher. Female POWs were marched eastward, sometimes hundreds of kilometers, into forced labor camps. Many never returned. Uniforms, once symbols of precision and discipline, now represented the very ideology the Allies sought to erase. The orders to burn them served both a practical and psychological purpose. It dismantled visible Nazi organization and prevented any form of regrouping. Allied reports noted that removing the uniforms reduced resistance, created submission, and broke the group identity that the Nazi system had instilled. It was, in essence, psychological demobilization. Where men had surrendered weapons, women surrendered symbols. By autumn 1945, Allied command centers in Europe recorded the destruction of thousands of Nazi garments and insignias, a silent campaign of cleansing through fire. No parades, no ceremonies, only ashes and administrative notes. Uniforms destroyed, identity documents confiscated. It was the most intimate disarmament of the war. The stripping not of armies, but of beliefs. In the silence after surrender, a strange transformation began. For years, these women had lived under a structure of absolute authority. Orders were followed without question, and obedience had been equated with virtue. The uniform was the visible proof of that obedience. It granted respect, belonging, and protection. When it was burned, that mental scaffolding collapsed. Psychologists working with German POWs after the war described what they called Uniformless shock of uniform loss. It was a sudden, profound disorientation. The realization that one's entire identity had been constructed by an institution that no longer existed. Many of the women experienced conflicting emotions. Shame for what the Reich had done. Relief that the war was over. Fear of retribution. But also grief. Not for the regime itself, but for the sense of purpose it had once provided. The human mind clings to order, even when the order is corrupt. And for these women, that order had vanished overnight. Allied interrogators often noted the same reaction. Confusion. When asked why they had served, many responded simply, "It was my duty." Few understood how deeply ideology had shaped that duty. The burning of uniforms, therefore, became more than punishment. It was a forced confrontation with self-awareness. The fire erased not only insignias, but illusions. In that moment of smoke and silence, they saw what remained when belief was stripped away. Just a person, standing alone, no longer part of something larger. And for many, that was more terrifying than defeat itself. After the guns fell silent, Europe faced a question no army could answer. How do you punish a nation and still remain human? For the Allies, the presence of German women in Nazi uniforms blurred moral lines. They were not innocent civilians, yet few had personally committed atrocities. Some were deeply indoctrinated. Others were simply following orders or seeking employment in wartime Germany. But guilt, in 1945, was no longer a personal concept. It was collective. The Soviet perspective was especially unforgiving. To them, the suffering inflicted by the German war machine had been catastrophic. Villages erased, families executed, entire populations enslaved. When Soviet troops captured female SS auxiliaries, they saw not individuals, but symbols of the same system that had burned their own people alive. For many Soviet soldiers, mercy felt impossible. In the Western zones, British and American officers tried to distinguish between ideological believers and administrative workers. But the moral clarity they sought often dissolved in gray. How do you measure belief? How do you separate loyalty from survival? The burning of uniforms symbolized this dilemma. It was both practical, preventing the resurgence of Nazi organization, and moral, a ritual of cleansing through destruction. Yet beneath that symbolism lay another truth. Justice and humiliation often walked the same road. To strip someone of a uniform was to strip them of power, but also of dignity. Some Allied officials worried about the optics of revenge, while others saw it as a necessary purge, a way to prevent Germany from ever finding pride in its past again. The moral tension of that act still echoes in history. It was not only about punishment, it was about forcing a reckoning, a confrontation with what the swastika had truly stood for. And in that confrontation, many German women faced the hardest realization of all. The ideology that had promised purity had left them impure in the eyes of the world. In every culture, clothing is identity. Uniforms, in particular, speak a language of belonging, of hierarchy, duty, and pride. When the Allies ordered the destruction of Nazi uniforms, they were not simply erasing military symbols. They were dismantling an entire cultural mythology. Under Hitler, German uniforms had become works of design and propaganda. Tailored to perfection, they projected confidence, power, and order. The black SS tunics, designed with deliberate precision, embodied fear and loyalty. The Luftwaffe blues and Wehrmacht greys carried the visual authority of discipline. To wear one was to participate in the aesthetic of domination. The Nazis had understood this perfectly. They built their ideology not just on words, but on spectacle. Marches, insignias, banners, and uniforms that transformed politics into theater. When the Reich fell, that theater had to be dismantled piece by piece. For civilians across occupied Germany, seeing these once dominant uniforms reduced to ash was a cultural shock. The women who had once stood proudly in them now stood exposed, stripped of the symbols that had shielded them from reality. It was as if an entire visual language, one that had defined German identity for over a decade, was being burned out of existence. The fires of 1945 became quiet funerals for a culture built on illusion. And yet, in the smoldering remains, a strange duality persisted. For some Germans, the loss of those symbols felt like freedom. For others, it felt like exile from their own history. Decades later, historians would note that few nations have ever undergone such a complete symbolic erasure. The act of burning the Nazi uniform was not just an order. It was a message. Your past is no longer yours. History remembers men as soldiers. But in Germany's war, women were soldiers of another kind, participants in an ideological machine that had promised them purpose, purity, and protection. For years, the Nazi regime had defined womanhood in narrow terms. Mothers, helpers, supporters of the fatherland. Yet as the war consumed more lives, women stepped into roles the ideology had once forbidden. Manning anti-aircraft guns, coding messages, and serving in SS offices. They were both constrained and empowered by the system that exploited them. When the uniforms burned, gender and guilt collided. Male POWs were stripped of weapons. Female POWs were stripped of identity. Their punishment carried a different tone: humiliation through exposure. Allied officers often commented that many of the women seemed stunned or ashamed, but not always repentant. The war had given them authority in a society that had otherwise denied it. Now, that authority was gone, leaving an emptiness that few could articulate. In post-war Germany, that silence deepened. Society did not want to remember its women as participants in Nazism. For decades, history portrayed them as victims, widows, mothers, survivors. The reality was far more complex. Many had been willing instruments of the regime, even if not its architects. The burning of their uniforms marked not only the end of a war, but the erasure of a truth: that women too had served, believed, and obeyed. Gender shaped how history remembered them, or didn't, and in that silence, their story smoldered for decades, like the ashes of those uniforms, fading but never entirely gone. The flames of 1945 had consumed fabric, but beneath the ashes, a deeper fire still burned: the reckoning of identity, guilt, and memory. Next came the moment when symbolism met reality, when the order to burn the uniforms was carried out in full view of a defeated nation. Germany, May 1945. The war was over. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound of any bomb. Across the Allied zones, the process of disarmament had begun. German officers surrendered pistols and rifles. Soldiers handed over ammunition and equipment. But for thousands of women, the clerks, radio operators, nurses, and SS auxiliaries, their weapon was their uniform. At one temporary camp near Magdeburg, British soldiers gathered a group of nearly 300 female Luftwaffe Helferinnen. They were lined up in rows, ordered to remove insignias, rank pins, and armbands. A British officer, speaking through a translator, instructed them to throw their uniforms into a growing pile. At first, no one moved. The silence stretched thin. Then one young woman, barely 20, stepped forward and removed her jacket. Her hands trembled. She tossed it onto the heap. Another followed, then another. Within minutes, hundreds of gray-blue tunics, skirts, and caps lay in the dirt like fallen wings. When the officer struck a match, a column of smoke rose against the pale morning sky. The fabric curled, cracked, and turned black. The fire hissed, a quiet, consuming sound. Observers later recalled the smell. A mix of wool, leather, and something else, the bitter scent of surrender. In the Soviet zones, the same scenes unfolded with less restraint. In towns like Gdansk and Wrocław, Soviet troops corralled captured German women, some from communication units, others from concentration camp offices. There was no ceremony, no explanation. The women were ordered to strip off their uniforms immediately. Those who hesitated faced the butt of a rifle or a shouted command in Russian. In some cases, uniforms were thrown into open pits and set alight with kerosene. Women stood barefoot in the mud, clutching blankets or civilian rags handed out by Red Army soldiers. A Soviet interpreter stationed near Poznan later recalled in his diary, "They did not cry. Most stood still, staring at the fire. A few laughed nervously, but the smell carried far. It smelled like the end of something." In the American zone, near Kassel, a U.S. intelligence officer named Lieutenant Robert H. Adams documented the process in a field report dated June 1945. He wrote, "The German female auxiliaries complied without resistance. Several appeared stunned, as if unaware until that moment that their service had placed them among the defeated. One remarked, 'Now we are nothing.' For many of these women, that sentence captured the core of the experience. Their uniforms had been more than clothing. They had been identity, purpose, and belonging. Burning them was an act of forced rebirth, one that few had asked for, and none could refuse." Meanwhile, in northern Germany, the British occupation authorities were conducting one of the largest systematic destructions of Nazi regalia. Warehouses filled with seized uniforms, both male and female, were burned in massive bonfires that lit up the night skies of Lübeck and Hamburg. Local civilians were made to watch. Photographs from the time show crowds standing silently as piles of swastika flags and field jackets went up in flames. The captions read simply, "Denazification in progress." But the faces in the crowd tell a deeper story. Expressions of disbelief, anger, and exhaustion. For some, it was justice. For others, humiliation. In a camp outside Weimar, a Red Cross nurse, a German woman who had served in the medical corps since 1941, wrote in her diary, "They told us to burn everything with an eagle or swastika, even our hospital aprons. I watched the flame eat the cloth and thought, this is what we are now, ash among ashes." That line, later discovered in her recovered notes, became emblematic of the quiet tragedy of that year. Not all acts of destruction were forced. In some towns, German civilians burned their own uniforms and flags before Allied troops arrived, out of fear, shame, or a desperate wish to start anew. In Munich, neighbors gathered in backyards at night, tossing Hitler portraits and party badges into small fires, watching the symbols melt away under starlight. The entire country had become a landscape of smoke and silence. Every burning uniform, every curling swastika, was a fragment of the old world turning to dust. Yet even amid this destruction, a strange unease lingered. For those who watched their uniforms vanish, the question remained, if everything that defined you burns, what remains? By the summer of 1945, the flames that had once engulfed Europe now smoldered quietly in camps, town squares, and courtyards. But something deeper was burning, the very idea of what it meant to be German. Across the Allied zones, denazification was no longer just a military operation. It had become a moral crusade. The Allies sought to strip away every layer of Nazism, not only from uniforms, flags, and badges, but from minds and memories. Posters were plastered on walls. "This is your fault. You are responsible. Never again." Civilians were made to walk through concentration camps to see what had been done in their name. In some towns, the same women who once proudly wore their auxiliary uniforms were escorted through the ruins of Buchenwald or Dachau. Eyewitnesses described the silence as unbearable. Heads lowered, hands covering faces, the stench of death still lingering in the air. For these women, who had once worked in offices or barracks, the burning of their uniforms was no longer a mere ritual of defeat. It became a mirror, reflecting everything they had been part of, willingly or not. A British report from Hanover noted, several of the female personnel expressed disbelief at what they saw. One said, "We only took messages. We didn't kill anyone." Yet as the photographs of the camps were shown, the realization grew. They began to weep. This confrontation between innocence and complicity would haunt post-war Germany for decades. Many of the women insisted they were only secretaries, radio operators, or typists, far removed from the front lines of brutality. But the Allied tribunal saw it differently. In their eyes, every uniform carried responsibility, every insignia a choice. At the Nuremberg trials later that year, prosecutors made a simple but devastating argument. The machinery of evil requires more than soldiers. It requires those who type the orders, decode the messages, and deliver the supplies. Without them, the regime does not function. This was the ideological echo of those burnings. Each thread of cloth destroyed in those fires was a strand of the system itself. A uniform reduced to ash, just as the Reich had been reduced to ruins. Meanwhile, in small villages and cities, Germany's women faced a new world of uncertainty. Once respected for their service, they now found themselves ostracized, shunned, or interrogated. Many were barred from employment, their wartime pasts following them like shadows. Some hid their old photographs or burned them in secret, afraid of being accused or condemned again. Letters from that period reveal a haunting duality, guilt and nostalgia intertwined. One woman, a former SS clerk from Berlin, wrote to her sister in 1946, "When I see the smoke from our chimney, I remember the day they made us burn our uniforms. I hated them for it. But sometimes I think perhaps they were right. We had to watch the lies burn before we could breathe again." Yet not all embraced this reckoning. Some clung to the belief that they had been victims too, of propaganda, of circumstance, of defeat. In whispered circles, the myth of the good German began to take root, softening the horror into survivable memory. The fires had erased the symbols, but not the ideology that had birthed them. Historians later described this as the silent war after the war, a psychological struggle that burned invisibly, inside homes, inside hearts. In the ruins of Munich, Allied officers noticed a strange phenomenon. Children playing with buttons and badges they found in the rubble, relics of a regime they did not understand. One officer wrote, "The children wear them like treasures, unaware that these are the ashes of the world their parents built." That observation captured the tragedy perfectly. The uniforms had burned, but the past still smoldered beneath the surface, quiet, buried, and waiting. By the end of 1946, the official burnings were over, but the symbol of those fires lived on. In newsreels and photographs, the image of German women casting their uniforms into flames became one of the most haunting visuals of post-war Europe. It marked the end of an empire and the beginning of an unending question. Can a nation cleanse itself by burning its symbols? Or does true redemption begin only when the fire burns within? In 1985, during a memorial in Bonn, an elderly woman, once a young Wehrmacht clerk, was interviewed. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "When we burned our uniforms, I thought we were only obeying orders again. But now I see, it was the first time we disobeyed the past. The interviewer later described her face as a mixture of sorrow and peace. And perhaps that was the truest image of post-war Germany. A nation learning that redemption does not come from victory, but from the courage to face one's own ruins. History often remembers the noise, the speeches, the battles, the victories and defeats. But the true turning points happen in silence. There are no parades when a person lays down a belief. No fanfare when a uniform turns to ash. Only the sound of fabric burning, and the breath of those who watch. In that moment, in 1945, as German women stood before the flames, the world witnessed something rare. Not the triumph of one side, but the beginning of human reckoning. Those fires were not just about uniforms. They were about memory and guilt and the fragile possibility of becoming something else. A nation once armored in pride and obedience was being stripped down to its human core and forced to ask what it meant to be free of the lies that had once defined it. Freedom, they learned, is not granted by conquerors. It begins when one stops serving the ghosts of ideology. For decades, Germany would live with those ghosts. It would study them, confront them, build monuments to them, and through that, become one of the most self-aware nations in modern history. And yet, in every archive and photograph, those women still stand there, faces gray, eyes fixed on the fire. They do not speak, but the silence says enough. Because every civilization, no matter how powerful, eventually faces its fire, a moment when it must burn its illusions to survive itself. For Germany, that fire began with a single command: remove your uniforms, burn them, and from those ashes rose not a nation of soldiers, but a nation of witnesses.